You have been taught to believe that the market is neutral, that it is a natural force, like the weather, blind, objective and fair. You are told that if you struggle, it is because you failed. If you suffer, it is because you did not compete hard enough. If you are poor, it is because you did not deserve more. This is the first and most effective lie of the system. The market does not care about you, not because it is broken, not because it has lost its way, but because it was never designed to care at all. The market is not a moral institution. It is not a democratic one. It does not exist to fulfill human needs or to secure human dignity. It exists to organize exploitation efficiently, to convert human labor into profit, and to concentrate power in the hands of those who own, not those who work. Capitalism presents the market as an impartial judge, but in truth it is a weapon wielded by a ruling class that lives from the labor of others. Behind every price is a power relation. Behind every choice is a constraint. Behind every contract is a class hierarchy enforced by necessity. You are told you are free because no one chains you to the factory gate, the office desk, or the digital platform. Yet your freedom is the freedom to choose which master you will serve, which wage you will accept, which form of exhaustion you will endure in order to survive. This is not freedom, it is coerced dependence disguised as voluntary exchange. The worker enters the market not as an equal, but as one who owns nothing but their labor power, compelled to sell it or face hunger, homelessness, and social death. Capitalism reduces life itself to a transaction. Time becomes a commodity. Energy becomes a resource to be drained. Creativity becomes intellectual property owned by someone else. Human beings are valued not for what they are, but for what they can produce, and discarded when they can no longer produce enough. The market measures worth in profit, and because profit demands growth without limit, it consumes bodies, communities, and nature with the same indifference. This system does not merely exploit, it divides. It teaches workers to compete with one another for survival, to see their fellow laborers as rivals instead of allies. It fragments the working class along lines of nation, race, gender, religion, and status, not to liberate difference, but to prevent unity. Division is not an accident of capitalism. It is one of its core survival strategies. A divided class cannot recognize its collective power. An isolated worker cannot challenge the system that exploits them. Ideology performs this violence quietly. Schools teach obedience and individual achievement, not collective struggle. Media celebrates wealth as virtue and poverty as failure. Politics offers minor reforms while protecting the foundations of private ownership and profit. Even suffering is individualized. Stress, anxiety, and burnout are treated as personal problems, never as symptoms of a system that extracts more than it gives and demands more than a human life can sustain. Yet history does not move according to the fantasies of the ruling class. Every system that appears eternal is, in truth, temporary. Capitalism itself emerged from the ruins of feudalism, not because it was just, but because material conditions made it possible. In the same way, capitalism creates the conditions for its own undoing. It concentrates workers in vast numbers, connects them across industries and borders, and subjects them to shared exploitation. In doing so, it creates not only misery, but also the potential for consciousness. Class consciousness is not an abstract idea. It is the moment when workers recognize that their suffering is not individual, but collective, and that their power lies not in competition, but in solidarity. When workers understand that the wealth of the few is produced by the labor of the many, the moral authority of the ruling class collapses. When they see that the market, indifference is structural, not accidental, the myth of fairness dissolves. The ruling class fears nothing more than organized labor with a clear understanding of its own interests. That is why unions are weakened, why strikes are criminalized, why radical ideas are ridiculed or censored. The system knows that machines do not generate value on their own, that capital is dead without living labor to animate it. When labor withdraws its cooperation, the entire structure trembles. Social transformation does not begin with the goodwill of those in power. It begins when the oppressed refuse to accept their conditions as natural or inevitable. It begins when workers organize not merely for higher wages, but for control over the conditions and purpose of production itself. It begins when society says that human needs come before profit, that collective well-being matters more than private accumulation, that democracy must extend beyond politics into the economy. The market does not care about you, and it never will. No amount of moral pleading can humanize a system built on dehumanization. But the future does not belong to the market. It belongs to those who produce the world with their hands and minds. When the working class recognizes itself as a historical force, when it acts collectively and consciously, it becomes capable not only of resisting exploitation, but of building a new society in which labor is no longer a curse, life is no longer a commodity, and human freedom is no longer sacrificed at the altar of profit. The choice before us is not whether the system will change, but who will shape that change. History advances through struggle. The task is not to beg for compassion from an indifferent market, but to abolish the conditions that give it power, and to replace them with a social order grounded in solidarity, equality, and collective control over the wealth we create. The market is often portrayed as an impartial, self-regulating mechanism, a neutral arena where supply meets demand, where prices rise and fall according to objective forces, and where opportunity is supposedly equal for all who enter it. This narrative is one of the most powerful illusions perpetuated by the ruling class, for it masks the reality that the market is not neutral, not fair, and not guided by any principle of justice. The market is a tool of class power, designed to concentrate wealth and control in the hands of those who already own the means of production, while shaping the lives of those who possess nothing but their labor. From the very moment a worker steps into the labor market, they are subjected to conditions dictated not by fairness, need, or morality, but by the imperative of profit. The value of a human being in the market is measured not by their dignity, creativity, or humanity, but by what they can contribute to the accumulation of capital. Wages are set according to the demands of efficiency and competition, not according to the actual needs of the laborer, and the laborer's survival depends upon accepting conditions that maximize the profits of the owners of capital. This system is enforced not only by economic structures, but by social norms, legal frameworks, and political institutions that ensure the market remains a tool of the powerful. Contracts, property laws, and corporate regulations are framed to protect ownership and accumulation, while workers are left with formal freedoms that disguise their material subjugation. The illusion of choice is everywhere. The worker can choose where to sell their labor, what profession to pursue, which consumer goods to buy, yet these choices occur within boundaries established by the needs of capital and the scarcity imposed by systemic inequality. The market cannot be understood as an abstract or natural phenomenon because it is constructed and maintained by the relations of power between classes. It is a social instrument that ensures the continuity of domination. The wealthy and the owners of production exercise power not only through direct control but through shaping the rules, norms, and perceptions that govern economic life. Prices, wages, and access to resources are never determined purely by supply and demand. They are mediated by power, negotiation, and often coercion. Moreover, the market obscures its own violence. When a factory closes, when jobs are outsourced, when wages are cut or benefits denied, the market presents these outcomes as natural consequences of competition, efficiency, or innovation. The suffering of the working class is framed as a failure to adapt, a deficit of skill or effort, rather than the predictable effect of a system designed to maximize profit for a few while extracting labor from the many. This narrative is bolstered by ideology, which teaches that the market is fair, that competition is virtuous, and that accumulation is a sign of personal merit. Media, education, and political discourse all contribute to the naturalization of economic inequality, creating consent for conditions that are otherwise unbearable. The market functions as a disciplinary mechanism, rewarding compliance and punishing resistance, ensuring that workers internalize their subordinate position and that challenges to the system are fragmented or marginalized. In addition, the market exploits not only labor but the very structure of human life, turning time, energy, and social relations into commodities. The worker's time is purchased, the worker's effort is monetized, and even social needs are mediated through purchasing power. The market does not care about well-being, justice, or human potential. It cares about accumulation, growth, and the reproduction of power. It is structured to be indifferent to suffering because suffering is often profitable, and scarcity is necessary to maintain the leverage of the owning class. In this way, the market perpetuates inequality as a structural feature, not as a flaw. Those who own capital wield the market as a tool of dominance, extracting labor, shaping consumption, and determining social outcomes according to their own interests. Every decision in the market, from investment to production to pricing, reflects class priorities, and every mechanism of the market is designed to sustain the hierarchy between those who control resources and those who must sell their labor to survive. The idea that the market is neutral obscures the truth that it is deeply political, deeply social, and deeply ideological. It is a system in which human life is subordinated to the logic of profit and where power and wealth are concentrated not through talent or virtue, but through ownership and exploitation. Understanding this is essential because it exposes the lie of impartiality and opens the possibility for collective action. If the market is a tool of class power, then it is not eternal, and it is not beyond transformation. The market's authority is not natural. It is constructed and maintained by social relations that can be challenged, resisted, and ultimately reshaped through consciousness, solidarity, and collective struggle. Recognizing the market as a tool of class power is the first step to an understanding that human life, labor, and society can be organized for needs, justice, and freedom rather than for profit and domination. Wage labor is celebrated in capitalist societies as the foundation of freedom, the cornerstone of personal responsibility, and the pathway to self-realization. Workers are told that they are free to sell their labor, free to choose their employers, and free to negotiate their wages. Yet this freedom is an illusion, a carefully constructed fiction that conceals the coercive nature of the economic system. The worker is free only in the sense that they are not physically bound to a master, yet in every meaningful sense their existence is constrained by necessity. To survive, to eat, to house oneself, to access health care and social participation, the worker must sell their labor power. This condition is not freedom, it is coerced survival. The very act of entering the labor market is an act of compulsion because the worker possesses no other means of subsistence. They own no capital, no factories, no land, and no independent source of wealth, and therefore they are forced to submit to conditions set by those who do. The wage contract presents itself as an agreement between equals, but in reality it is a negotiation between unequals framed by structural inequality. The employer holds the power backed by the authority of law, social norms, and economic necessity, while the worker's choice is constrained by hunger, debt, and social exclusion. Capitalism transforms survival into an exercise of obedience and self-discipline. The worker must sell their hours, their energy, and their skills for a wage determined externally, often below what would be required to secure a dignified life without long hours or multiple jobs. The laborer is legally free, yet materially bound. They are allowed to leave one job only to enter another, because society has made it impossible to survive without selling labor. Even the ability to refuse exploitation is a privilege rarely available, accessible only to those who possess independent means or inherited wealth. Wage labor is thus not voluntary in any meaningful sense. It is coercion embedded in the structure of daily life, in social expectations, in economic scarcity, and in the rules of property and ownership that define the capitalist system. The ideology surrounding labour disguises this coercion as choice. It tells workers that if they do not succeed, it is because of laziness or incompetence. It equates the acceptance of exploitation with personal responsibility and positions dissent as moral or practical failure. Work is framed as self-expression and advancement, and the grinding monotony, exhaustion, and precarity of survival are reframed as necessary steps toward a better life. This ideology does not merely misrepresent reality, it shapes consciousness, making workers internalize the logic of their own subjugation. It encourages them to see their exploitation as meritocratic and their necessity to labor as natural. The coercion inherent in wage labor is magnified by the imperatives of the market. Competition among workers forces them to accept lower wages, longer hours, and deteriorating conditions. Each individual struggles not only to survive, but to maintain a position relative to others, fragmenting collective strength and reinforcing dependence on employment. The market appears to reward effort, but in truth, it rewards compliance with the demands of capital and punishes autonomy. Wage labor is also coercive in its temporal dimension. Life is structured around the requirements of labor, with work hours dictating the rhythm of existence, leaving little space for leisure, creativity, or autonomous activity. Workers exchange their time, the one resource they possess, that is wholly their own, for wages that may only partially sustain them, and they are compelled to return day after day. The seeming voluntariness of this exchange conceals the structural necessity that drives it. Furthermore, wage labor is embedded in broader social structures that limit alternatives. Education, property ownership, healthcare, and even citizenship rights are tied to participation in the labor market, reinforcing the compulsion to sell labor. Social survival, legal rights, and even identity are connected to one's position as a worker, creating a system where freedom is conditional, constrained, and largely illusory. The result is a life in which survival is dependent on submission, and where personal choice is subordinate to structural necessity. Workers are compelled to participate in a system that prioritizes the accumulation of capital over human need, and the rhetoric of freedom masks the fundamental coercion that sustains the system. Wage labor is therefore not an expression of liberty, but a condition of dependence. It is survival enforced by social, economic, and political structures disguised as voluntary exchange. The worker appears to have autonomy, yet every aspect of their participation is mediated by the imperatives of capitalism. Every decision, from where to work to how long to labor, is shaped by the necessity of securing subsistence, not by true choice or moral preference. Understanding this is crucial, because it reveals that the problem is not individual laziness, incompetence, or lack of ambition, but a system that imposes survival as submission and freedom as illusion. It is within this structure of coerced necessity that the logic of exploitation operates, and it is through the recognition of this coercion that workers can begin to see the possibility of collective action solidarity. And the transformation of labor into genuine freedom capitalism is not merely an economic system, it is a social relation structured to extract maximum value from human labor while maintaining the dominance of the owning class. Its survival depends on the systematic exploitation of those who create wealth and the deliberate fragmentation of those same producers. The working class, the creators of all social wealth, are compelled to sell their labor power under conditions that favor the accumulation of capital for the few. Every wage paid is less than the value produced, and this surplus labor is transformed into profit, reinvested, and concentrated to strengthen the position of capitalists, landlords, and financiers. Exploitation is therefore not incidental to capitalism, it is its defining principle. The system is designed to extract as much from workers as possible while keeping them dependent and compliant. This is accomplished through legal, social, and economic mechanisms that make survival contingent upon participation in the labor market, ensuring that those who produce wealth remain subordinate to those who control its distribution. But extraction alone is insufficient for the reproduction of capitalist power. Capitalism also requires division. The ruling class cannot maintain domination over a conscious and united working class, and therefore it encourages and enforces fragmentation among labourers. Workers are pitted against one another in a constant struggle for wages, jobs, and security. This competition is presented as natural, even virtuous, but its purpose is clear. A divided working class is easier to control. The system exploits differences of race, gender, nationality, and skill to prevent solidarity, presenting inequality among workers as inevitable rather than manufactured. Immigrant labour may be valued less and subjected to harsher conditions. Women may be paid less for the same work, and marginalized communities may be excluded from opportunity. These divisions are not accidental. They are tools of control that maintain hierarchies within the laboring class while preserving the profits of capitalists. Ideology reinforces this division by teaching that inequality is meritocratic, that wealth is evidence of virtue, and that poverty or hardship is a result of personal failure. Education, media, political institutions all contribute to this narrative, framing collective exploitation as individual misfortune and isolating workers in their struggles. In this way, the consciousness of workers is shaped to accept their condition, to compete against each other rather than challenge the system as a whole. The mechanisms of capitalism also extend beyond the workplace, influencing social life to further fragment the working class. Housing markets, consumer debt, educational access, and healthcare provision are all tied to employment, creating multiple points of dependence and competition among workers. This ensures that economic vulnerability is a constant, maintaining pressure on individuals to conform, to accept low wages, long hours, and unsafe conditions. Social life itself is commodified, producing relationships mediated by money, status, and consumption rather than solidarity and mutual support. Within this context, strikes, labour movements, and collective bargaining are constantly undermined, either through legal restrictions, corporate policies, or social stigmatization. The threat of losing employment, being blacklisted, or being socially marginalized is a constant reminder that individual laborers are powerless when isolated. Only by overcoming this imposed division can the working class recognize its collective strength and the systemic nature of its exploitation. Capitalism as exploitation is not limited to the material extraction of labor. It also affects the mental, social, and creative capacities of workers. Labor is structured to maximize productivity and profit, often at the expense of human well-being, autonomy, and creativity. Work becomes repetitive, alienating, and dehumanizing, disconnecting workers from the products of their labor and from the social and natural world. This alienation reinforces dependency, making workers more compliant and less likely to resist, while deepening the psychological and social divisions among them. Division and exploitation feed one another. Exploitation generates material need, scarcity, and precarity, which in turn heighten competition among workers and reinforce internalized hierarchies. Workers may see one another as rivals rather than allies, blame peers for their own struggles, or adopt the ideology of the ruling class that frames inequality as deserved. This is the genius of capitalist power. By simultaneously extracting value and fostering division, it maintains the dominance of capital with minimal direct coercion. History demonstrates that these divisions are not insurmountable, and that solidarity can overcome them. Where workers recognize their shared exploitation, they can organize collectively, challenge wages and working conditions, and demand structural change. Collective action, from strikes to unionization to political movements, exposes the fragility of capitalist power and the dependence of wealth on labor. The system's reliance on division is also its vulnerability. Capitalism cannot function without the labor of the many, and no amount of ideology can permanently suppress the potential for consciousness and unity among workers. Exploitation and division are therefore not natural or inevitable. They are tools, historically constructed, maintained, and contested. Recognizing this is critical because it frames the struggle not as a matter of individual improvement or moral virtue, but as a political, social, and economic battle over power, resources, and control. It shows that the contradictions of capitalism, the need to extract labor while keeping workers divided, create openings for resistance, for the development of class consciousness, and for the possibility of a society in which exploitation and division are no longer mechanisms. A social organization. Ideology is one of the most powerful instruments of domination within capitalist society, for it shapes consciousness, organizes perception, and renders the structural nature of inequality invisible. It persuades individuals to interpret social relations as natural, inevitable, or the result of personal merit and failure, rather than as products of systemic exploitation. Through ideology, suffering is individualized, moralized, and depoliticized. The working class, while experiencing exploitation collectively, is taught to understand hardship as the consequence of personal inadequacy rather than the structural logic of a system designed to extract surplus labor for the benefit of a small elite. Schools, media, religious institutions, and political rhetoric operate in concert to reproduce this worldview, present inequality not as a social problem, but as a reflection of individual virtue, skill, or effort. Wealth is framed as evidence of talent, intelligence, or industriousness, while poverty is depicted as evidence of laziness, incompetence, or moral weakness. These narratives are not accidental. They are essential to maintaining consent for a system that requires laborers to produce wealth for others while accepting their own subordination as natural. Ideology shapes desires, aspirations, and expectations, guiding workers to pursue advancement within a structure that inherently limits their autonomy and reinforces inequality. The promise of upward mobility, meritocracy, and personal success functions as a psychological mechanism to align the interests of the oppressed with the priorities of the powerful. Workers compete for limited opportunities, striving for symbolic markers of achievement, while the broader structural conditions of exploitation remain unchallenged. This competitive mindset divides the working class internally, pitting individuals against one another rather than directing attention toward the collective mechanisms that perpetuate exploitation. Ideology also obscures the relational nature of wealth and poverty. It presents society as a collection of independent actors, each responsible for their own outcomes, rather than as a network of social relations shaped by power and property. In doing so, it individualizes the consequences of systemic failures. Job loss, wage stagnation, or inadequate health care is interpreted as personal misfortune, rather than as the predictable outcome of capitalist imperatives to maximize profit and minimize labor costs. Workers internalize blame, experience guilt, and adjust their behavior to conform to the expectations of the system, often without recognizing that their struggles are shared and structurally determined. The commodification of life is reinforced through ideology, transforming even human needs and desires into market transactions. Education, healthcare, housing, and social mobility are treated as personal achievements contingent on access to money and opportunity, rather than as social rights or collective responsibilities. This naturalization of scarcity ensures that inequality appears inevitable, concealing the choices, priorities, and power dynamics that produce and reproduce it. Furthermore, ideology operates by normalizing and aestheticizing exploitation. The daily rhythms of labor, the extraction of surplus value, and the alienation of workers from the products of their activity are presented as ordinary, unavoidable, or even virtuous. Hardship becomes a test of character, and compliance becomes a moral imperative. The logic of efficiency, competition, and innovation masks the human cost of these processes, presenting exploitation as the price of progress. This normalization extends beyond the workplace into social and cultural life. Popular culture, media narratives, and Political discourse celebrate individual success and stigmatize collective struggle, reinforcing the sense that personal ambition is the primary vehicle for improvement, while obscuring the systemic factors that constrain outcomes. Workers are taught to aspire to ideals that are largely unattainable for the majority, focusing energy on personal advancement rather than collective action. The effects of ideology are both psychological and material. By internalizing the supposed fairness of the system, workers consent to conditions that perpetuate inequality, competing for recognition, rewards, or social approval that are unevenly distributed and insufficient to challenge the structure of exploitation. The individualization of suffering also suppresses the development of class consciousness, preventing workers from recognizing the shared nature of their oppression and the potential power that exists in collective organization. Ideology, therefore, functions as both a veil and a weapon. It conceals the relations of power that structure society while actively shaping thought and behavior to reinforce those relations. It ensures that exploitation appears voluntary, inequality appears natural, and resistance appears unnecessary or misguided. Yet, this ideological control is neither absolute nor permanent. The material conditions of life, the shared experiences of exploitation, and the contradictions inherent in class consciousness is the awakening of awareness among workers that their individual struggles are not isolated misfortunes but the product of systemic exploitation under capitalism. It is the moment when laborers recognize that their suffering, precariousness, and lack of control over their work are shared experiences rooted in the social relations of production rather than personal failings. Without this recognition, oppression appears natural, inequality seems inevitable, and the mechanisms of domination are accepted as immutable. Class consciousness transforms passive endurance into critical understanding, revealing that the wealth accumulated by the owning class is produced by collective labor and maintained through the subordination of the many. It allows workers to see themselves not as atomized competitors, but as members of a social force capable of challenging the structures that exploit them. This consciousness emerges from the lived experiences of labor, the alienation of producing goods one does not own, the extraction of surplus value, the repetitive and exhausting rhythms imposed by the market, and the precarity that accompanies dependence on wage labor. When workers begin to connect these experiences with broader social structures, they develop the insight that their condition is neither accidental nor the result of individual deficiencies, but the consequence of a system organized to concentrate wealth and power. Class consciousness is not merely intellectual recognition, it is the foundation for action. Awareness alone cannot dismantle exploitation. It must be coupled with organized solidarity, the deliberate coordination of collective effort toward shared goals. Solidarity allows workers to combine their strength, to act as a unified force capable of resisting the mechanisms of capitalist domination. It transforms individual grievances into collective power, converting passive frustration into organized strategies for change. Strikes, unions, cooperative movements, and political organizations are expressions of this solidarity, providing workers with the means to negotiate, challenge, and ultimately restructure the conditions of production and social life. Capitalism relies on the fragmentation of labor to maintain its dominance. It encourages competition among workers, divides them along lines of race, gender, nationality and skill, and promotes ideologies that present inequality as natural or deserved. Solidarity counteracts these divisions, building bridges across differences and cultivating a shared understanding of common interests. It emphasizes the interconnectedness of struggles, demonstrating that the liberation of one group cannot be fully realized without the liberation of all. Organized solidarity also amplifies the capacity of the working class to challenge the state, corporations, and social institutions that uphold capitalist power. By coordinating demands, pooling resources, and sustaining collective action over time, workers gain leverage that far exceeds what isolated individuals could achieve. This collective strength can secure higher wages, better working conditions, and social protections, but more importantly, it lays the groundwork for systemic transformation. The development of class consciousness and solidarity creates the conditions for envisioning and building a society in which labor serves human needs rather than capital accumulation. It fosters the understanding that wealth production and social organization can be collectively controlled and democratically managed. Workers begin to see the potential for a society where exploitation is abolished, where labor is a source of fulfillment rather than coercion, and where the fruits of collective effort are equitably shared. Education, discussion, and shared struggle play critical roles in cultivating class consciousness. As workers exchange experiences, analyze social relations, and confront the contradictions of the system, they refine their understanding of exploitation and inequality. This intellectual development is inseparable from practical action, as theory and praxis reinforce one another. Historical struggles demonstrate that social transformation arises not spontaneously, but through the conscious, organized efforts of those who recognize their collective power. Class consciousness motivates workers to challenge the legitimacy of the existing social order, to resist oppression, and to create alternatives that reflect their interests and needs. Organized solidarity ensures that these challenges are effective, coordinated, and sustained, preventing the isolation and demoralization that capitalism seeks to impose. The combination of consciousness and solidarity transforms the potential for resistance into tangible action, converting the collective recognition of exploitation into the power to restructure society. It enables workers to confront not only immediate grievances but also the underlying structures that perpetuate inequality, alienation, and domination. In essence, social transformation is the product of collective awareness and collective action, the recognition that individual survival depends on collective struggle, and the understanding that liberation is impossible without unity and organized effort. Class consciousness illuminates the pathways of oppression, while organized solidarity provides the tools to traverse them, to challenge the entrenched power of capital, and to lay the foundation for a society organized around human need, cooperation, and equality. The truth is now clear. The market was never meant to serve you. Wage labor is survival, disguised as choice. Capitalism thrives on exploitation and division, and ideology masks the structural nature of your suffering. Yet within these conditions lies the potential for transformation. The collective awareness of your shared oppression, class consciousness combined with organized solidarity becomes the force capable of challenging the power of capital and reshaping society. The future does not belong to the market, to corporations, or to those who profit from your labor. It belongs to the workers, the creators of all wealth, when they recognize their power, unite across divisions, and act together. Social change is neither granted nor optional. It is seized through struggle, awareness, and collective action. The market will never care about you, but united, conscious, and organized, you can demand a world in which human needs, dignity, and freedom take precedence over profit, and where labor serves life rather than exploitation.